Welcome to Star Canon, where we are obsessed with Star Wars Unlimited. I'm Ryan, and I'm so glad you're here because today we're talking about Pre Vizsla by request. Yeah, so someone left a comment on one of my other videos asking what a Pre Vizsla deck would look like, and I had never thought about it, so I wanted to try it out, and I came up with this mono red or pure aggression monstrosity. Actually went 2-1, and I think if I'd practiced at all, or maybe picked a few different cards in here, could have took the whole thing. So let's talk about it. So first of all, interesting thing about this leader is that they are one of the few who does really different stuff, whether they're on their front side or if they've been deployed, right? Most leaders, their deploy side is very similar to the front. Maybe it's just a stronger version of whatever they were doing, or it's one that now triggers on an attack rather than an action or something like that. But for Pre Vizsla, on his front side, as an action, we can pay a resource and exhaust him to deal damage to a unit equal to the number of cards we have drawn this phase. So that means during the action phase. So it doesn't count the 2 cards that you draw for your turn, because that happens in a different phase, right? So we need to find ways to draw extra cards, and then we can turn that into damage. But when you deploy Mr. Vizsla, he becomes a 4/6 with 2 different things going on, right? He says while you have 3 or more cards in your hand, he gains saboteur, fine. And while you have 6 or more cards in your hand, he gets +2/+0. So he becomes a 6/6 saboteur, potentially, and he can deploy at just 5 resources, which can be quite strong, but it is hard to have a hand with 6 cards in it when you're at 5 resources. I think a lot of people saw this during previews and were like, well, that's basically impossible. And they just kind of wrote this guy off. But again, I had pretty decent success with him at my store this week. Again, going 2-1 in best of 1 on Wednesday night. Okay, so with those front and back things in mind, how do you begin to build a deck around Pre Vizsla? Well, I think the first trap people fall into is that you got to be drawing lots of extra cards every turn so you can use his ability every turn. And realistically, that's just not possible, at least not with the card pool we have with just 3 sets. So I looked for opportunities to count that as more of a bonus, and when I could do it, great. But I didn't build the deck to just draw as many extra cards as I could to try and get a huge burst of damage off of this guy, because I knew that that wasn't really going to be possible. Now, the upside is that when he's deployed, any extra card draw I had would still make him a better unit. But again, I didn't have to do a lot to go out of my way to make that happen. It's just a deck that is still good enough on its own. And any time that we can use our leader either as a better version of his leaders of his unit self, or get more damage out of his front side, those are good things. But we don't have to warp the deck just to make those happen. Okay. All right. So as usual, we're going to look at our units first. Then I'll cycle back through and talk about events and upgrades and stuff like that. So number 1, Viper Probe Droid. This is just a solid card. It is good early game. It starts attacking for 3. Trades with almost any other 2-drop, right? And even late game, if you play it and you just want to know what their last 2 cards that they're holding, do they have their bomb Luke Skywalker? Are they bluffing? What's going on here? Do we got to watch out for super laser blast? Stuff like that. Getting a peek at their hand at any point is good. So the probe droid just seemed like a logical inclusion here, and I don't play a lot of villainous decks, so I don't really know what I'm doing. But this felt like it was worth having. Going with the droid, we've got 3 copies of Bo-Katan from set 2, and she's double red, so that's cool because this is one of the few decks that can actually play her on curve. And upside, when defeated, for each player who has 15 or more damage on their base, you draw a card. Well, hey, this is an aggressive deck. We want to be drawing extra cards, so when this works, it's really great. But even at its worst case, it's still a 2-cost 3/3, which is a Battlefield Marine, which is one of the best 2-cost units in the game. So that's what we're looking for, right? If I could just run 15 copies of Bo-Katan and they weren't unique, that would be what this deck really wants. But we don't have that, so the rest of the cards we kind of gotta find stuff that operates in a similar space. And that's just, again, kind of what motivated me to put this list together. So once we've got Bo-Katan in there, well, now you start looking at other maybe Mandalorian synergies or payoffs as well, because our leader is also a Mandalorian. So keep that in mind. House Cast Soldier. Again, we just needed some more 2-cost units, and this is a fine one that happens to be a Mandalorian, and it's got Saboteur. And I thought that this deck would kind of struggle against like Sentinels and roadblock type things because we want to be aggressive and pour on the damage as fast as we can. So having ways to get in there for 2 or 3 with our Overwhelm or Saboteurs or things like that do add up. And then the last 2-cost ground unit, I had 1 copy of the other Bo-Katan from set 3 in my collection, and this one gets better when we've got other Mandalorians and other troopers, and the deck is loaded with them as well. Now, if I had a few more of these, I'd probably put in, the full playset, probably dropping the House Cast Soldiers, but I use what I have, and that's, again, part of what I do in these videos, right? I don't tell you to go out and buy this and buy that, and here's the perfect deck that's guaranteed to win you your next planetary qualifier. It's more like, here's what I've got, and I have a reasonable collection. I usually buy 2 boxes, 2 booster boxes, plus do the pre-release, and I get my prize packs every week. So I've got some cards to work with, but not a ton of legendaries, and not every rare. So that's what I've got. I got a Bo-Katan. In goes this version of Bo-Katan. The Mandalorian theme continues as we get into our 3 drops with Deathwatch Loyalist and Mandalorian Warrior. Again, just kind of finding ways to overlap my synergies here. These guys don't draw cards, but they do attack reasonably well, and they just fill the curve, which is what we need, right? Next, though, we go up to Saw Gerrera, who is a double red card, and again, one of the cool things about playing a double red deck, you get to use all these cards that are sitting in trade binders all around the world because no one knows what to do with these things. Saw is pretty good, I think. He hits for 5, and he punishes our opponent who tries to play any sort of event, really. I mean, again, this deck wants every bit of incidental damage that it can get, and punishing them with an extra 2 if they want to use takedown on this guy or literally anything else. Hey, that is still worth having. Joining him in the 4-drop slot is Jango Fett, another unit that could draw us cards. So when that works, it's great. When he attacks and defeats a unit, we get to just draw a card. And he does have a little bounty synergy as well, and the deck does have some bounties in it, but we'll talk about those later. And moving up to the 5s, we've got Clan Challengers, which, 5 for a 3/6 with Raid 3, but it's also a Mandalorian, and it can get Overwhelm while it's equipped, and we're going to talk about why that is super important in just a moment. I also put in 3 copies of my favorite droid, I think, IG-11. Well, maybe not. Maybe R2 is my favorite droid. But IG-11 is a sweet card, right? It hits hard, and this one synergizes really well with our leader, because if we've been able to ping or deal some extra damage with that, now we get to do an extra 3 on something when we attack with our IG-11. So I really like how those play off of each other. And finally, for ground units up at the top, Wild Rancor, because I've got, again, 2 copies that were just sitting there collecting dust. And I figured, hey, double red, let's put them in and just start overwhelming and crushing stuff and dealing 2 damage to other ground units. And that works with our IG-11. And you kind of get this cool snowball effect happening there. And then at the very, very top, 2 copies of unit version of Pre Vizsla, just to kind of complete the theme, but every deck needs a haymaker, and this guy attacks pretty well at 8, and you get to kind of do some monkeying around with upgrades and things like that. So it just felt like a good bookend for the deck. We got Bo-Katans down at the cheap end, we've got Pre Vizsla up at the top, and those are our ground units. Now for space, we just have 6 cards, 3 copies of the gunship, because I needed another 2-drop, and this one met that criteria, right? 2 damage at a time is not a lot, but when it's defeated, we get to throw 1 extra point of damage somewhere, which is sweet. But the real important card here was the Confederate Tri-Fighter, the 3/3 for 3 that just simply says bases can't be healed. This might have been the MVP in the whole deck, I don't really know, but I feel like every game I played this, I felt unstoppable, because my opponent would play Yoda and Kanan and Queel, and they didn't do anything, right? If your opponent cannot answer the Tri-Fighter, then all of their restore just becomes useless and your units just pile on the damage, and that can feel really, really good. So I like this card quite a bit. Again, I don't play a lot of villainous stuff, so getting to use this was kind of a cool experience for me, and I'm glad I found room for it in the deck. Okay, enough about units. What really made this deck tick was actually the events and upgrades package, so we'll go through those real quick. I've got one copy of old access codes in here, and so this is when I'm designing a deck or trying out a new idea for the first time, I just kind of look at everything that could work, right? And maybe try out one or two copies, and over time I will refine this list into something hopefully really kick-ass. But for today, we're looking at just one copy of old access codes because I didn't know if it was going to be good, bad, ugly, I don't know. When played, if an opponent has more units than you draw a card. Okay, that's works with our leader, but I think a lot of people would look at this and be like, oh, I want to draw as many cards as I can. I want 3 copies of old access codes, and I'll just keep drawing cards, and then I can just build up a lot, and then I can just use my leader's ability. More likely, this is in here to trigger stuff like my clan challengers, giving them an upgrade so then they get overwhelmed. Or I could throw this onto my leader to help him hit a little bit harder while he's got that saboteur ability active, and I could just slip by all of their defenses. But ultimately, this was just like a fun of, whatever. And I don't think it would survive into the next version of this deck, but it was cool to like play around with and see if that was something that would be worth making room for. Then I've got 2 copies of Deathmark. Again, this is a bounty that will potentially draw me 2 cards, which does work really well with my leader. Keep my hand full, no matter what side he's on. That's like always valuable. And it's got some bounty synergies with Jango Fett, and you can do some fun stuff with that. I don't know if I need like a 3rd copy of this or cut it entirely. I still would want to experiment a little more. It was never like a truly dead card for me. So I'm encouraged to kind of keep playing around with it, but I can't say like absolutely this deck needs 3 copies of Deathmark. It was fine, but I think that there could be better stuff in this slot. So another card that I just ran 1 copy of was Twice the Pride, and I think this one was better than I had expected it to be, and I might go up to 2 or 3 copies of this, maybe trading off the Deathmarks, because there's some really interesting things going on here, right? If you give this to your Deathwatch Loyalist, okay, so that's the 3/3 with Grit and Overwhelm, he now becomes like a 9/1 or something, right? Like, because he gets the +2 from the Grit and then the +4 from the Twice the Pride. So if your opponent isn't ready for that on like turn 3, that's a ton of damage, and that feels great. You can also hand this to the clan challengers, right? Again, because they get it Overwhelm while upgraded. And then so between their native 3 plus the raid 3 plus the +4 from Twice the Pride, they can hit for 10. And then you can, use your Pre Vizsla unit to like move this around and like hit again with it. You could even throw this, I guess, on a ship. It doesn't say like a non-vehicle, right? So you can turn your 3/3 Confederate Tri-Fighter into a 7/1 and like kill somebody in 3 or 4 turns in space. So I don't know. I think it's pretty good. And the fact that this is a double red deck means this is one of the few that can get away with playing it. So I might go back and put in a 2nd or 3rd copy of Twice the Pride. Now, the next 2 events are really, really what made this whole deck sing. And the more important one is I Am Your Father. That's why I'm calling this deck Daddy's Home, because Pre Vizsla is your daddy. I'm your father. Deal 7 damage to an enemy unit unless its controller says no. If they do, you draw 3 cards. Well, the trick is to not look at this as a 3-cost event that might deal 7 or draw 3. You look at this as a 4-cost event that kills something. Okay, so at that point, it is kind of like a takedown or Fell the Dragon or whatever. But your opponent is in a really awkward spot if you've got 1 extra resource after you play this, because then they're like, well, do I let it deal the full 7 damage and I lose my Cad Bane or whatever? Or do I just let my opponent draw 3 cards, which then Pre Vizsla turns into another 3 damage anyway? So like you're still probably killing something and refilling your hand and making, the flipped or deployed side of Pre Vizsla even bigger, right? You might have just turned him into a 6/6, depending on where you're at in the game. So I'm Your Father is probably the single most important card that works with this leader, And then mission briefing is a similar idea, right? It's a pay 3 to draw 2. Really, you want to have a fourth, an extra resource when you play this so that you can draw 2 and immediately deal 2 to kill something, probably something that was already wounded, or to at least set up an attack with IG-11 or whatever you need to do, right? But those 2 cards together kind of keep things flowing and give you more cards in hand and can trigger your leader's ability, and that's really what you want to do. Now, obviously, I'm Your Father is technically better because it's always going to either be 7 damage or you draw 3, whereas mission briefing only gets you at best 2 cards. But that's what I thought that this deck needed the most of, right? So definitely glad that I had those in there. Then we've got just a single copy of Open Fire. It's nice to have something you can draw to pick off anything that needs to die, right? Like mono red doesn't have a lot of ways to like directly answer stuff. And I didn't want to like overload on these, but maybe old access codes should become another Open Fire just because it can be really flexible and a good way to deal with stuff that you can't otherwise get around. And then we have 2 copies of the Darksaber. And I'm lucky enough to own 2 of these. I know they're a pretty expensive legendary. I don't think you have to have them. You could probably just use twice the pride, here or something, some other piece of equipment. But since our leader is a Mandalorian, and since we have so many others in the deck, it's a really powerful turn to deploy Pre Vizsla, slap the Darksaber on him, attack. He throws experience onto Bo-Katan, Deathwatch Loyalists, Mandalorian Warriors, and your board just starts to quickly get out of control. And if you've still got 3 cards in hand, so Pre is a saboteur, then you can ignore sentinels, you can ignore shields, you can ignore Obi-Wan Kenobis, you can just hit them for a lot. And that is how I ended up winning most of my games, right? Get your leader, deploy him, upgrade him, and swing at the base like your life depends on it. And then finally in the bottom row, 1 copy of Forced Surrender, which was kind of an experiment, right? Draw 2 cards, so it does work with our leader, but you really want a 7th resource. And it has the potential upside, if you've damaged your opponent, they're going to have to discard some stuff as well. That was really hard to pull off. I think I just resourced this every time, but this is, again, trying to get a sense of, hey, do I want the really cheap old access codes that may or may not work for me? Do I want the more expensive Forced Surrenders, which always will draw me something and maybe even do more, but it's a lot harder to fit that into my curve? Well, the answer ended up being the middle stuff was the best, right? The 3-cost mission briefings, the 3-cost I'm Your Father. Those gave me the ultimate flexibility. So I would probably just trim the edges and just run those core cards like I already talked about. And there are 2 other legendary cards in the deck. That's 2 copies of Unlimited Power. I got one of these in my pre-release kit for Twilight of the Republic, and the other one in a prize pack like 2 weeks ago. So I figured, hey, again, double red, let's put these in here and get the dream of just dealing like a ton of damage for 6, right? And it's 4, then 3, then 2, then 1, and you just get to blow up everything. And your leader is going to get in there and do a ton of damage. Hopefully you've got someone with a Darksaber or twice the pride or whatever, and you just leave your opponent with nothing. And this is basically like a pocket-sized super laser blast for a double red deck. Felt awesome. Probably don't need a 3rd copy. Maybe I don't even need 2. Maybe just having 1, because this deck can draw so many cards. You see a lot of your deck, and you're probably going to draw it just in time to really steal the game with it. So the only other thing to talk about is the base, right? I went with a simple Deathwatch hideout here, keeping the full 30 HP. Probably could have ran Tarkentown because we're going to be doing that incidental ping damage there with our leader, or, I don't know, twice the pride on somebody or open fire, and you kind of soften them up a bit, and then Tarkentown would finish them off if we needed. I wanted to keep the extra HP. I wasn't super confident against other aggressive decks. I didn't know if I could, beat a Sabine to the finish line or something like that. But you do you. This was a cool experiment. Again, somebody had asked me to make a Pre Vizsla deck. Pre Vizsla, I don't even know how to pronounce this guy's name. I've literally never heard it. I haven't watched the Clone Wars or whatever he's from. I'm mostly a movie guy. I've started getting into some of the books, and I'm trying to catch up on some of the cartoons and the other shows. Obviously I'm a big Star Wars fan. I just have not seen every piece of media, so forgive me for butchering this guy's name. All I can tell you is this deck slaps. I'm going to keep working on it. If you've got ideas on what I should add or take out, by all means, leave them down in the comments. Then make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the exciting adventures we have here on Starcanum. We'll see ya.